Close the door, so I guess that's our signal. I invite you to join with me in a moment of prayer, will you please? Bless, O God, this exchange of information, and thank you for the moments to do so. In Christ's name, amen. Last week we did one over the world from creation to the time of the Bible, history, study of anthropology, if you wish, the beginning of life forms and the movement into the region of Mesopotamia from which the Hebrew people will eventually come and evolve, Abraham, according to the Bible story, biblical account. Today we're going to pick up on a little bit more of that history, but we're looking primarily at the development of speech and writing. And with it, again, I'll show you several archaeological finds and discoveries that are significant to setting the stage for the writing and the formation of the Bible. So it's a little bit of a lengthy journey again, but I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. Try to finish by 10:15 so the praise band can do their practice and I don't interrupt with their time. So, with that, we proceed. This is pretty logical. I think most of us would understand this, that things probably began with some kind of oral communication and eventually developed into some word format or verbal kind of communication. Obviously, at all times, I'm doing it right now. Nonverbal, I'm shrugging, we do those kinds of things, head nods, those nonverbal pieces. But what we are interested in is primarily the written communication and how we got to that level of ability. So, if you are a literalist, in other words, you read the Bible literally, or like many people in the world, not most, let me say many are selective literalists. They choose which parts of the Bible they believe literally and which parts are not. Some because there are metaphors and they understand that there are metaphors. But if you are a literalist, then God created the world 4,000 years ago, as James Ussher said, and made it look 13.8 billion years old, and made it look like there were dinosaurs, and made it look like there were Neanderthals, and made it look like there were cave people. And so we get to people who just come here with the ability to speak. I mean, after all, Adam and Eve are certainly communicating with God, right? So if you're a literalist, you've got the problem solved pretty quickly. But if you're not, and I don't mean necessarily evolutionist in the sense of the opposition of creationist, but I mean just simply one who believes that things did evolve. My dad was raised in the horse and buggy days. He and my mom dated that way, okay? Then he got to see somebody go to the moon. I started out with a two-hole privy out back, and now I've got modern conveniences in the home. I started out with a crank wall phone, X number of shorts and X number of longs. That's how you got to somebody. And today we have these wonderful devices called cell phones that we can take anywhere. I even have a Ford Pass for the new car that I can start it from here, okay? And those kinds of things. The technology has evolved, hasn't it? So I'm one of those people who believes that things have evolved over a period of time, and I'm not trying to put anybody into the evolutionist camp. I am simply telling you where Jerry Black is and what's behind this particular presentation. So, some scientists believe that speech began long ago, 27 million years ago, but probably more realistically about 300,000 years ago, when we see the migration of people, as we talked about last week, from Morocco through Egypt and into Mesopotamia over a period of time, and probably even more realistically, we're talking about the development of speech and some forms of human communication more in the 30 to 40,000 BCE. if we're looking scientifically, and for all of these reasons that are on the slide. And again, starting with probably grunts and groans, and then perhaps picking up what we call onomatopoeia, which is essentially words that resemble sounds. How many of you remember Batman cartoons? And you remember pow, all right, in kind of, or kapow, as it was from time to time. So, this is essentially what we're talking about, words that resemble the sounds. Or, so maybe that's the beginning. Evolving into systems and words and eventually writing by some 7,500 years. Starting with tokens and symbols, and I'm going to show you examples of each of these. Ideograms, pictograms, which came first? I mean, they've almost developed simultaneously, and there's very little distinction between the two. Hieroglyphics, most people are familiar with because of the discoveries in Egypt and the writing on the walls there. And then eventually we get to what we call cuneiform, which is wedge-shaped letters, and I will give you some examples of each of these. Now, again, we're going to look at this part of the world that's today, modern-day Iraq, for the most part. Susa is in Iraq, and you can barely see that, but you can see the circle. We're also going to look at some discoveries from ancient Kish, which we talked about a little bit last week when we were talking about some of the history, and of course Uruk, which is just above Ur, from which Abraham came. So this is kind of the cradle of civilization, as is referred to, because this is where civilization of a complex nature with urban developments and so forth, and speech and writing begins to evolve. So just kind of a review and a connection. Here are some of the early tokens that were used, dating back possibly as far back as 7,500 BCE. Most of these probably came from around 3,000 BCE. And they would be sort of like later on, people will write on parchment and roll it in scrolls, and they will seal it with a wax, and they'll put a signature in it. So these may have been signatures, they may have been IDs, they may have been exchange of measurements. Okay, for example, this represents 3 pounds, or this is how much I will pay you. This is my pay, So these tokens are the first forms that we have from archaeological discovery. An ideogram is essentially a way of communicating ideas or concepts. In this case, this is probably a goat, maybe going somewhere. That's a singular one. And then we move into pictograms. In this case, the hand indicates that the individual is receiving something. The dots are the amount of what this individual is receiving. The one just to the left of the hand is a symbol for grain or for harvest, some produce. And the one to the left of it is an individual from which the produce actually came. So he's receiving this produce from this individual that he has grown. I don't know if the symbol down in the lower left is a winnowing hook, an early form of a winnowing hook, or what that might represent. Maybe almost looks like a Jewish candelabra too. So I'm not real sure what the whole message means, but those are just typical of the early symbols and pictograms that we have. And these are on stone. I'll talk a little bit more about these. The early Sumerian script is, and remember, when we talk about the earliest dynasties in ancient Mesopotamia, we started out with the Sumerians, and then come the Akkadians, and then there are the Neo-Sumerians who come along behind after that. And then we have the first Assyrians, the first Babylonians, because we'll later run into Assyrians and Babylonians in Bible times. This is pre-biblical time that we're talking about, we talked about last week. So this Kish tablets come from the Sumerian region during the Sumerian dynasties. And again, you see the hand, which is probably a sign for receiving, not waving. but receiving something, or giving something, but probably in this case, because it's open, it's about receiving. And what the rest of that one means, I don't know. Some consider these limestone tablets from the ancient Mesopotamian community of Kish. This is located east of Babylon, by the way, about in south central Iraq today. The oldest known script, even older than the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Some people believe that. I'm not sure. Some even believe it's older than the Chinese script, and yet I've been able to find some evidence of Chinese script dating back to the 6th century BCE. So my hunch is that's not necessarily the case. It's probably simultaneous development. Some of these stones, which look rather large on the screen, are really no bigger than a credit card. They're pretty small, but they found several of them. And this is the dig site where those were found. Then we get into ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. These are probably toward the 3000 BCE, these particular images. You can see them a lot clearer than I can. I have a lot of light in the back, so I just want to make sure that you're able to see those. Don't ask me what they say. I can't read it. I am not a philologist. Yeah, that's a person who studies language and writing and that sort of thing. So I'm not one of those any more than I am an archaeologist, any more than I am a PhD professor. So, back to my disclaimers from the first class. So I don't know what they say, but they're just examples of early forms of communication. We'll deal a little bit more with those later on. These probably came from somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 maybe, but probably closer. The Egyptian civilization didn't coalesce until about 3150 BCE, according to historians. So I think the 3200 is probably a little more accurate. And by the time these hieroglyphs are really developed by, say, the time of Moses in the Bible, by 1200, 1300 BCE. By the time those things are fully developed, there were 700 to as many as 800 different images that are used. A lot of them are used by priests, and they are used to write down or copy down prayers, or they're used to write on sarcophagi, or they're used to write on the walls of a tomb, for example, to show the deceased the way to Akh, A-K-H, which means the world of the spirits of the gods, to show them. So they're somewhat theological a lot of times. So then we finally get into cuneiform, which is beginning to see some shapes in letters. We're using a combination of pictographs, ideograms, and mnemonic symbols with consonantal. And remember, Hebrew was originally just written in consonants. It wasn't until the 10th century CE, that the Masoretes, who were scribes, started adding appointing vowel sounds to the Hebrew text. So that was originally all in consonants with no vowels, no A, E, I, O, and U until 1000 CE, just about 1,000 years ago. And then you have the alphabetical lettering, which we'll kind of follow this script. This slide shows you something of the evolution of going from, the image for sun at the top is really interesting to me. I would have thought it would have been an oval, something that resembled the sun, and now, so these early symbols are kind of interesting as to how they started out. And then you eventually get into these nail-shaped letters toward the end by 500 BCE. Well, really, The earliest portions of the Bible were probably written around 900 BCE, so you start looking at the Assyrian period of time, 700 and a little bit before, and those are some of the shapes that would probably have been used. But again, we'll get a chance. Here's another slide showing that development, that I'm going to use the word evolution again, that evolution of writing, okay? So from 3,000 to probably 500 again by number 7, even the first. Okay, the administrative tablet, most of these tablets were found near ancient Uruk, just north of Ur, okay, that I showed you on that map a little while ago. And they're very similar to the Kish tablets, as you can see. But they're only just a little ways away from where the Kish tablets were. Kish and Uruk are just, ancient Kish and ancient Uruk are just short distance away from each other. So that's not too surprising. Then we get into alphabetical writing, where we begin to see A, B, C, D, E, or some form of an alphabet at least. The pyramid texts are among the oldest known religious texts in existence. Sentences in the old Egyptian lettering on walls of sarcophagi and on the walls of the pyramids as well as the tombs. These are something probably like chants or spells. They're offerings, instructions for the deceased transition again into the afterlife. This is a color copy that somebody made, an artist developed of some of that script, which makes it stand out a little differently. And you can see somebody leading this boat, if you wish, into the afterlife. And the person in the middle would be the deceased being escorted. The Sumerian king list is from about 5300 BCE in terms of the Sumerian Empire, but it's toward the end of that Neo-Sumerian Empire that these were produced. Some of them are mythical, about who is the king and who isn't. They come from southern Mesopotamia. This clay tablet is about 4 inches by 8 inches. So it's something of a cube, but it's very, very small. And as we talked about last week, there is this Epic of Gilgamesh. And just for those who may not have been here, Gilgamesh was probably a real king in the Uruk dynasty. Again, we're talking Sumerian, and there were Ubaid and Uruk and some other dynasties within the Sumerian dynasty period of time. So this probably was the 5th king of Uruk, and again, this would be in modern Iraq today. And the first half of the story relates of a friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, just a friend of his. And Enkidu is a wild man who was created by the gods, and yet they developed this friendship. And together they journey to what was called Cedar Mountain. And the story itself is probably myth. It's probably not true. And yet myth simply means story, so that's a wrong way to use myth. The story is probably not true. Let me put it that way. It's probably fictional, but it's a poem, an epic poem, and they travel together to Cedar Mountain, and where they're trying to defeat this monstrous guardian of the mountain, but that doesn't work out. So they later travel together to find the secret of eternal life. This is pretty important because this just indicates what is probably happening in societies other than Mesopotamia. It's probably other than Egypt. It's probably happening wherever there's life forms like Russia, We know that there are remains that go back in Russia to about 6,000 BCE. So, this is probably happening, the quest. Why am I here? Who am I? This is a pretty natural thing for people to try to figure out and to find some answer and resolution. So Gilgamesh in this fictional story is with his friend Enkidu, and they're trying to find the secret. Along the way, Enkidu dies, and it is a very heavy moment for Gilgamesh. And he runs into this sage, this wise individual, who begins to tell him various stories, and one of them includes the story of a great flood. Okay, so this is why this find is so significant to us today. Then we start getting into, as we talked about law codes, we tend to think that God gave Moses and Aaron directly the laws that appear in the Bible. And that is possible. I am never going to say that didn't happen that way. God is in charge of these things, not Jerry Black. Thank goodness. Okay. But it is probable that God used these early laws, like the law code of Ur-Nammu. Again, this comes from that same region in southern Mesopotamia or southern Iraq today. It's the oldest known tablet with codes of law. It's written in Sumerian cuneiform text, and again, don't ask me to read it. I would not know how to do that. I'm not one of those guys. But this is one of 5 or 6 different law codes that come from this area. Here is the code of Hammurabi. The law code of Hammurabi, he was one of the kings in that Babylonian dynasty. Remember, Sumerian, Akkadian, Neo-Sumerian, Assyrian, Babylonian. He was a king from the Babylonian period of time. And this is very extensive, some 282 laws. And remember, one of them, it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. There is the code of Lipit Ishtar. There is the laws of Eshnunu. And they all share one common theme, though they develop it differently. One crime, one punishment for the crime. Okay? That's a principle that's applied in each of these law codes. This is about 7.5 feet tall by about 27 inches wide, actually in circumference at the base, okay? And it probably weighs something like about 4 tons. It is one huge piece. And this is one of the most expansive pieces of early writing that we have. And again, that's where the writing is, okay? So it's down in the heart of that, and it comes from the end of Hammurabi's rule, probably. Combined his military and political advances with irrigation projects and constructions of fortifications and temples, celebrating Babylon's patron deity. The image is probably Shamash, which again, as you go back to last week's presentation, it was something else in the Akkadian Empire, but here in this Babylonian dynasty, it's another name. The names of the gods, remember there were 100 different gods or so that people believed in, and I showed you a list of about 12 last week of the primary gods. Well, the names changed on those, and so, okay? And then we begin to get into the script that will develop in the land of Canaan, or what will become Israel, Palestine today. This is some of the early forms of that, the precedents, and then what will develop into the Phoenician. Phoenicia would be where modern-day Lebanon is, north of Israel. And the Phoenicians were known for their trading, and so they needed to have the communication ability and the writing ability to effect their trading. Okay, so we'll get into that. And then those are the precedents or the precedents to the Hebrew, Aramaic, and eventually Greek. Although Greek will pretty much come from the Egyptian style. And here's just one artifact that has been discovered that shows that script. And then we get into these tablets that come from Nuzi. We talked a little bit about these last week. Again, this is in northern Iraq. This would, or north central at least, not quite to the Kurdistan area, but certainly from the area of Kirkuk, as I've got up there. These are administrative tablets. They record business transactions, and they span probably some 100 years. They found several of these. The Turin King list. Now we have some script that is on papyrus. In a future class, we'll talk about how papyrus was essentially developed, and we'll go through the various different sources for writing. This is from the city of Thebes in Egypt. It's the beginning and the beginning and the ending of this list are missing. This is just some pieces that were found. This is 11 columns listing the gods. Now, I'm showing you this slide. We're now talking about the time of Moses and Joshua. The Turin King list helps us date Moses. So, some people believe Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They're often referred to as the books of Moses. So the ability to write was certainly there, though most scholars believe that the earliest pieces of the Bible were written about 300 years to 400 years after Moses. And then I just showed you the pre-Canaanite script, so we are now talking about the people in Canaan. And here we are talking about Joshua's conquest going from Moab into Canaan. Now, again, just for information's sake, I remind you that some scholars don't believe that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of those were necessarily real people. They don't believe that Exodus actually happened. And the reason why is we have no archaeological evidence. We have no evidence outside of the Bible to support that story. I'm going to emphasize yet. We're still making discoveries all the time, and it's always possible. I just want you to know that some believe. And why would they make this up? Well, they're trying to show that their God is greater than anybody else's God, and this is how God intervenes and liberates. Oversimplification, we'll get into that a little bit more as we go down the road. But just for hypothetical purposes, following the Bible story, this is the time of Canaan, and certainly there's the ability to write and start recording. But again, it probably doesn't happen for another 200 to 300 years. The Merneptah Stele is a piece of evidence for the script at this time. It's by an ancient king, Merneptah, from this time period, referencing a campaign against Israel. And here's a close-up reference to the piece that refers to Israel. It is the oldest reference to Israel outside of the Bible, so 1210 BC. And again, this was found in the city of Thebes, which is in Egypt as well. And so here is the city of Thebes, just so you can see where these discoveries were made. The Gezer calendar refers to monthly and bi-monthly times for planting, tending to specific crops, and it was found pretty close to Jerusalem, as you can see. And now we're beginning to see some of the ancient Hebrew type script. This is Phoenician probably, possibly, again, who knows for sure, but it's early Hebrew. Let me show you at least a letter. This can be a dalet. That can be a dalet or a kaf, a D or a K. They're very similar in shape, especially in ancient Hebrew. But that's just one simple example. There's also a rho and some others in there, the letter P. This is a small part of the Shishak relief. It is an image that was etched into stone on the wall of the Karnak temple complex, showing all the cities that were conquered by Shishak the first, the Egyptian pharaoh, from 954 to 924 BCE. Okay, the importance here is that this is still the United Kingdom. The divided kingdom from the biblical perspective. Israel is one, has one king, Saul, David. This would be during David or Solomon's reign, actually probably Solomon's reign when this happens. So this is about the defeat and some of the Israel, again, as I remind you from our very first class, is so strategically located. It is influenced by one hegemony after another, because somebody is always trying to control Israel because it's on a major trade route right along the Mediterranean. And so little old Israel, as small as it is, even today, it is a political, military, economic significance. So here again, the battles. King Rehoboam reported that, let me just back up. This Egyptian pharaoh was famous for waging war against Judah, sacking Jerusalem, and taking the temple treasures during the time of Rehoboam. He replaced those treasures with bronze copies. Okay, that's evident as well in the Bible. Here's a larger section of the wall, and again, this is still a lot of mnemonic symbols, it's still a lot of pictographs, it's still a lot of ideograms, but it is also beginning to include some shapes that resemble letters that will be picked up. And again, this is Egyptian. So Shishak reportedly came from his capital, which would have been Bubastis. That would have been his capital, across the Sinai Peninsula all the way to Jerusalem with a massive army, according to that Shishak relief, of some 60,000 cavalry and more than 1,000 chariots. Now that number, by most scholars' estimate, is probably exaggerated tenfold. So probably 6,000 and maybe 100 chariots, something like that, more realistically. And we get into the same kind of, is it exaggeration or is it real, when we talk about 2 million Jews crossing the Sinai Peninsula after the escape in the Exodus. That's what it would have been, 600,000 foot soldiers along with their families. And then you've got to add all the animals and creatures. Is that hyperbole? Or is it precise, accurate reporting? Pretty large number to survive. The Moabite stone was found in ancient Dibon, now spelled D-H-I-B-A-N. That's in Jordan, some 40 miles south of Amman, and just east of the Dead Sea. Okay, now remember the last class we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this is in that same vicinity, only it's a mammoth stone. It was discovered in 1868 by an Anglican priest and measures some 3 feet tall by 27 inches thick as well as probably 27, 28 inches wide, probably weighs somewhere around 2 to 3 tons. It dates to about 886 to 885 BC, as you see on the slide. And Omri was the 6th king of Israel. So now we're into the divided kingdom. That's why this stone is important. We've gone from the United Kingdom under Saul, David, Solomon. Now it's 922 has happened. There is a division. Remember when Solomon died, the people from northern tribes asked if he was going to continue the taxations with which they had been burdened under Solomon. And his son Rehoboam said, yes, I'm going to do that. And so the tribe said, no, we're going independent. And so they had the schism and the split. 10 tribes in the north, essentially 2 in the lower portion, part of Benjamin, and all of Judah, and Judah being the primary tribe that survived. But Omri was 6th king of Israel, which is in the northern kingdom, from the highly debated time of 884 to 873 BCE. Now, why debated? All of these dates that I've been talking about, 1250 for Moses, 1200, 1210 for the conquest, those are debated by scholars throughout time. Did Abraham come as early as 2100 BC, or was it, as the traditional date, 1850 BC? And I've been kind of sticking to the traditional dates because, particularly as we get to this part now, these pieces of information outside of the Bible begin to support what we find in the Bible and the dates and the time. Okay. So the interesting thing about, this is a larger view of that, and this is Canaanite script, which I didn't say in the earlier, which again is similar to what will be Hebrew. Now, see Dibon, that's where this piece was found, or the first piece that I talked about, and the Moabite stone will be found east of just east of the Dead Sea there. So if the king of Moab, all right, decides to attack, it is, and this is the divided kingdom, it isn't Jerusalem that he takes these pieces from that we just talked about in this slide. Omri was the king and he oppressed Moab, and I took the vessels of probably their god. Okay, well, it would have been, during the divided kingdom, Jerusalem was the temple place still, and the headquarters or the capital for the southern kingdom. But in the northern kingdom, it's going to be, let me develop it, Samaria is going to be the capital. Bethel is one of 2 worship places. Dan will be the other, and it's north. It's way, let me get it up here. It's going to be way up here. So this is Bethel. Samaria is the capital. This is a worship center, okay? I forget that I can't turn away from the mic because it doesn't record for the later production. Okay, so he had to come, the king from Moab had to come across probably pretty much like the Israelites did for the conquest, across by Jericho, and came down to Bethel and probably took those religious pieces from the temple at Bethel, or the worship center, let me put it that way, so we don't confuse. This obelisk is a stone pillar, usually square and set up as a monument somewhere, and in this case, this is one in Assyria. Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria, about 840. Again, we're doing and it shows Jehu, probably Jehu, who was king, paying tribute to the Assyrian king, so the Assyrians are on the rise now. And they will really begin, eventually, by 722 BCE, the Assyrians will completely deplete the northern kingdom. All of the tribes will either be killed or dispersed. They will be relocated throughout the Assyrian Empire, mostly for you, over in Mesopotamia, back in ancient Mesopotamia, Iran, Iraq, that sort of thing. Okay? So the northern tribes will disappear, but this is before they do. And again, you can still see that communication is still largely pictograms, even though there's the ability to write, and there's still so much of it going on. This House of David inscription is interesting because it is, if it does say David, there's debate as to whether it says the word is David or if it is uncle among scholars. But if it is a reference to David, as many scholars believe, then it is the oldest reference to the house of David that we know about. And so again, we have some documentation, not only to the writing, but to the people. This fragment was discovered in 1993 at Tel Dan, which I'm going to show you the map location in just a moment, in the very most northern part of Israel, and boasts an unknown king's victory over Israel and its ally, the house of David. Tells how the Israelites, so during the divided period of time, there's the defeat is of the northern tribes, but also of Judah. The house of David would be Jerusalem. Okay? And this is recorded, if you want to check this as a biblical reference, is 2 Kings 8, verses 7 through 15. Tells how the Israelite prophet Elisha appointed Hazael to become king of Syria in order to punish Israel for her sins. Interesting. Some of the interesting. While war raged between Syria on one side and the combined forces of Israel and Judah on the other, the present Syrian king Ben-Hadad lay ill in Damascus, according to the biblical text. To obtain a favorable prognosis, he sent Hazael with a gift to Elisha, who happened to be in the area. So you're going back to some of the older parts of the Bible to hear that story. This stela mentions, and again, a stela is a stone monument, mentions a number of kings from both Israel and Judah, and the reference is probably to the Syrian king Hazael and the defeat of King Jehoram, son of King Ahaz, and Queen Jezebel. Probably. This is where that piece was found. It's a memorial fragment. And on a map, this is where Tel Dan is located. And I'm also going to talk here in just a moment about a piece from Tel Arad. So I just decided to use the same map. And this is Tel Arad. That's a big dig. This is a massive area. This house of Yahweh, Ostrakhan, an Ostrakhan is simply a shard, a piece of pottery. And now the script is really visible for writing. It probably is a 6th century BCE piece. One of 200 inscribed pieces of pottery found at Tel Arad in the 1960s. 107 of these are written in Hebrew, and the rest are written in Aramaic. So both languages have now evolved not only in speech, but in writing. So this would be the look of early Hebrew, Old Hebrew. A little different than modern, I'll show you in just a moment. Aramaic, as it has evolved now by the 7th century BCE. So the ability to record is part of what drives scholars' thinking about when the Bible began to be produced. And again, probably the earliest pieces are about 900 BCE. Even though there was script available in Moses' time, and Moses was raised in Pharaoh's courts, and so Moses would have been trained. So it's possible Moses wrote pieces of those and they survived, but not likely, probably passed by orally. This is modern Hebrew, of which I can't remember a whole lot from my seminary days, but I still try to read some every now and then. And modern Greek, which many of you know because of Greek sororities and fraternities, if nothing else, right? Phi Kappa Beta or Delta or whatever, I don't know. I was a part of Alpha Omega Eta. That's a local social fraternity out of a Baptist college who couldn't have national frats. So, first it's the development of language and oral expressions in Samaria first, and then Acadia, and then in subsequent Assyrian and Babylonian periods or dynasties. It's first ideograms and pictograms, it's hieroglyphics, and then it's cuneiform wedge-shaped letters refined by alphabetical scripts, and finally Old Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It's this literary development, along with the contribution of other cultures, as I say here on this slide, that helps shape the production of the Bible. And that's our other class is about. How did we get the Bible? Well, it's all this stuff that went on before that probably gave a lot of shape to it and influence. Those laws, for example, 5 different sets of laws that we know about preceding the 613 we find in the Bible. And some of them word for word the same. So probably the influence, God uses the influence of those laws to pull together the laws that are to guide and the life of the Hebrew people together. Okay, I finished 1 minute after my time. Questions that I probably can't answer? Then blessings, thanks for joining me on the journey. We will continue next week. We'll look a little bit down the road here at how manuscripts were developed, how codices were saved, and some of the oldest manuscripts we may have, the whole production of manuscripts, that sort of thing. Those are interesting stories in and of themselves. All right, blessings to you. Worship team.